Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Mexico's drugs cartels are undoubtedly the most violent in Latin America, but why is it that the state seems so powerless to tackle them? Mexico is, after all, one of the largest economies in the world. Falko Ernst is widely regarded as the leading expert on organized crimes in the country, and one of the few people with access to the cartels themselves. He joins us now. Hello and welcome, Falko.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Now, I know you've just been having some dental maneuvers. Are your teeth okay?
I'm still kicking.
Good, good. I'm very glad you could join us. I think that the best thing to start off with is to try and sort of, cartels come in different forms and varieties, and we'll sort of learn that through this discussion. But just take one as an example. Give us an example of one and describe the breadth of its operations.
Right. So I want to start from sort of like common myths, I would say, when we think about cartels, right? Basically, so what you see in the press, what the state likes to see many times is just armed elements out in the streets, out in the countryside with Kalashnikovs in their hands, fighting it out. In reality, that is a very important part of how these groups sustain themselves, of how cartels sustain their power, how they make claims towards society, towards the economy, and towards the state. But it is only one wing. The other ones consist in logistics. It's absolutely essential to have a good logistical team of operators that is capable of getting things across the border of different natures, not only drugs. We'll go into greater depth about what they traffic, what they peddle, but logistics is absolutely key. It's a very skilled game, and it connects to the white-collar world that is usually not on the list of stereotypical suspects, as it were. And that brings me to the other absolutely essential segment you need to have as a functional cartel, which is the lawyers, the notaries, the people that sit within institutions. So the white-collar segment that connects you to the state, that permits you to have conversations with state power holders, with elected officials, and so on and so forth, so that the state applies, especially in the Mexican case, I think, the law in your favor in a very discretional form, to put it this way. And then ultimately, you need a social base, which has become a key element of, again, cartel power as they have become more sedentary as organizations. They hold entire patches of land nowadays, and you need the population on your side to a certain degree, at least, in order to keep them from rebelling, to rising up against your claim of power. And so you need to invest into social legitimacy to a certain degree.
Okay, I'll come back to that in a second, because I think it's a very sort of key important point. If you look at the history of the cartels, I think we are, sadly, I suppose Netflix is going to be people's main source of information for this. But if you think back to the world of drugs stars, we go back to Colombia, and that's when we have the first knowledge of all powerful drugs organizations. When did cartels emerge within Mexico?
So in Mexico, we're looking at a very, very long history that has changed the game completely, right? We're talking about very humble beginnings, marijuana being grown out in the fields in Sinaloa states and other states in Mexico along the Pacific coast, above all, some poppy being thrown into the mix. But it was really smuggling operations and local peasants growing different natural products, as it were, and then selling off in a largely free, laissez-faire market where you didn't have cartels in an economical sense of the word, i.e. You could sell to whoever you wanted, and buyers would come into this communities take over and then smuggle the stuff mostly into the United States, of course, across the border to get their margins. And over time, especially as democracy kicked in and the Mexican state lost some of its governance capacity, especially in the past 25 years, these groups realized that they could branch out massively into the business of real power over society.
So that's two things. So basically, you have a more authoritarian government that sort of leaves, giving the arrival of democracy, and you're saying that gives the cartels a space to exert their own authority.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, organized crime isn't new. It was part and parcel of the authoritarian system that Mexico was characterized by for more than 7 decades in the 20th century. And pockets were being lined back then as well. But you had a very powerful, centralized, rather efficient state in place that was able to discipline the stereotypical bad guys, to discipline those that were seeking to increase their power overly vis-a-vis the state. And with democracy, with the advent of democracy, different power networks occupy space within the state, and thus they lose their coherence, and they're not as good anymore at dishing out corruption and keeping the whole violent play at acceptable limits to society and also the state itself.
Okay, and one of the questions sort of popping up in my mind is that, so if you have at the same time, when you have a authoritarian regime sort of no longer there, you're saying generally is corruption more possible? Does that sort of coincide at the same time?
I wouldn't necessarily is more possible, but corruption is not being exercised as efficiently anymore. So before, you had stable contracts between organized crime and the state. If you paid the state, and if you didn't dance out of line too much, if you weren't too public about your power, about your income, you got away with a lot of things, and you were being sold effective protection by the state because it could do that as an authoritarian regime. Then with democracy, you have different networks of state actors trying to peddle corruption to different criminal actors. And those contracts become very unstable because there's a lot of competition between these different networks, right? Basically over who gets access to the state. And that becomes a problem because when those contracts don't work anymore, when it don't guarantee security, then illegal market participants transcend that and go into trying to secure what they see as their rights by applying violence. And this is how we end up with current crisis of overwhelming violence that has haunted Mexico for really the past 20 years.
Okay. I mean, I suppose that this is the broader point, is the whole point of this conversation is to show that the cartels have to be seen in a broader context, a context that's a social, economic, and political. Whereas the response to organized crime for the last 2 decades, or even going back for much longer, we think back to the Reagan era, is the war on drugs, is the idea of combating it militarily.
That's right. I mean, we can go back as far as Nixon, really, for the first round of such a thing called as the war on drugs on Mexican soil. And I think the wrong view that's been applied here has always been that there is a clear division between state and crime, that the two aren't completely entangled in many, many ways. Which is not to say that there aren't people within state institutions here that want to do their job right, that want to do the right thing. But corruption is a common feature of how security bodies operate in Mexico. And if you think you can just surgically remove the problem by militarily going after their visible manifestation, i.e. the guys that do the killing on the ground, but you don't go after the root causes, above all corruption, the white collar segment, and also social inequality, lack of opportunities for legal careers, then you're just going to be playing the whack-a-mole game over time. And this is what we've seen from administration after administration. And the current atmosphere in the White House under the new Trump administration, I mean, they're repeating precisely the same recipes, although in a harsher tone than before, but as such, there's nothing new.
It just sounds good politically, doesn't it? It's like an easy solution, and you're sounding tough as an electoral winner.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it sells electorally so far. It's sold electorally in the past elections. The terror classification of Mexican crime groups is selling politically, because that is based on, yes, the notion of an easy solution toward a complex problem that everyone who's ever looked at the problem, that includes policymakers in the United States, they understand that when you talk to them off the record, they will tell you that. But there is only a long-term solution to this, and that is politically not necessarily palatable.
Okay, well, let's come back to that example of the cartel. You talked about logistics. You talked about having been able to sort of pay off the right people at the top end, and white collar crime to go with it, accountants, that kind of thing, and being able to change policy. Can you talk about it at a more basic level? I mean, we think of them as bad guys. We think of them as peddling drugs, but within the local community, that's not the case at all.
Well, it can be the case. It kind of depends on who you end up with as a local civilian, right? Basically, I mean, the criminal population has exploded so much that there has been great instability within criminal organizations. So we have a crisis of good criminal leadership, to put it somewhat polemically, really, that a lot of historical leaders that were more politically minded, that were trying to negotiate their power with other groups and the state, have been taken out of the picture as wins on the PR front have been produced during the war on drugs. And so what has been washed up into leadership positions is many times younger men and people who have only learned the business of violence and who then ended up in leadership positions, and they are bad at governing many times. So they have grown very, very aggressive toward their own communities. Many times we're talking about kidnapping of small fries, like the local taco maker, for instance, basically, who gets picked up, and then the family gets to pay up, sometimes to a happy ending, sometimes not to a happy ending. There's not a guarantee to that anymore. And especially, they have turned massively against the legal economy, big and small, by leveraging criminal taxes, by going big time into the extortion business, which is a heavyweight, which is money directly out of the pockets of local civilians who are trying to carve out a living out of very dire situations as it is. So that's been sort of the story of the past years. And overall, a lot of these groups, they have grown smaller and smaller. As such, we had about 6 relatively coherent cartels back in 2006 when the last round of the war on drugs started. And today, estimations have it that we are facing about 200 illegal armed actors out on Mexican streets, right? And a lot of those guys aren't the cream of the crop. They don't have these international ties to successfully traffic drugs to Europe, to Australia, to the United States, which requires a certain sophistication. So what they do, they peddle drugs locally. They make their own methamphetamine above all, sell it to local civilians, sell it to local communities, to farm workers a lot. And they turn, again, via extortion against the local economy, basically. So they have become a true cancer to local communities.
Okay, and at the same time, you're seeing competition between those groups as well, which is leading to more violence.
Exactly. One of the effects of this hyper-fragmentation of the field of criminal groups in Mexico has been that power is so evenly distributed that no one can really decide the battle for themselves. Because once you make gains, then others team up with your competitors, and there's a backlash, and so on and so forth. So what we've ended up with is a latent state of really armed conflict by now, which is often fought over territories that aren't any larger than 30 by 40 kilometers or so. They have literally been on an arms race, which is, for me, one of the most worrying things we're seeing currently on the ground. So, it started with feuds between criminals, between members in criminal groups, between leaders. They were using small and medium-sized arms, semi-automatic rifles, handguns and whatnot. Then about 10, 12 years back, you started seeing a large distance and very high impact sniper rifles, 50 caliber sniper rifles that have a range of more than 1.5 kilometers that can penetrate armoring and so on and so forth. And I'm just back fresh from the field, actually, from a state called Michoacan, which is ground zero for the latest round of the Mexican war on drugs in 2006. And what civilians are facing there right now is IEDs, improvised explosive devices being used, that orchards, dirt roads are being mined by terrestrial mines, and that drones are being used to drop bombs onto civilian populations. So the whole thing is really, really spinning out of control, again, because we haven't had a sound strategy to rein that in over the past years.
It sounds absolutely incredible. I do want to, perhaps you could give us some recent examples of where these clashes have been taking place, and then maybe there's a really garling example of a so-called extermination camp being run in Jalisco, further south. And it just seems a sense of impunity. So that brings us to what the government policy would be is. But just give us, if you could talk about the clashes between the two groups in the south, and then we'll talk about that camp as well.
Yeah, just want to highlight the role of impunity real quick. So, if you think about the mutation of these groups, how dangerous the whole phenomenon has become, that's been because there has been a perverse interest and or an incapacity to really apply the law. I mean, the law has been peddled many times to the highest bidder, and it's a standard feature of how security institutions, including the military, operate. And one effect thereof has been this arms race, but another effect has been that these groups have found it very easy to branch out geographically into new areas. So when you look at the map of violence back in 2010, 2006, it was fairly limited, mostly to central Mexico and northern Mexico. And ever since, you have seen sort of like encroaching out into other spheres in Mexico. And currently, where some of the hardest clashes are taking place is on the Pacific coast, which is key for everything you want to traffic north and south, respectively. Here we're talking about states of Guanajuato, which is very important for the industry in Mexico. A lot of cars manufacturing going on for overseas Pacific trade. We're talking about the states of Colima and Michoacan. There are massive clashes between the Jalisco cartel and clusters of local competitors. And in the north, in the state of Sinaloa, which used to be a rather calm region ever since the leaders of that cartel were extradited and or taken out of the picture in other forms under US pressure or by the US directly, these groups have turned against each other. So it's become hyper-violent. Then just to throw that into the mix, and there's a long list, unfortunately, of conflict sites, regionalized conflict sites. Another hotspot has been the state of Chiapas, which borders on Guatemala and is sort of a gold mine for criminal interests because you can traffic things internationally, there's high margins, but there's also local mining, local natural resource extraction, and so on and so forth. So really talking about a very wide portfolio of criminal attractions that have been underpinning these, the fighting in these local sites.
And the stunning thing is, if you electorally, the issue that Mexicans say repeatedly that matters most to them is security. It is the top political issue. Yet you wouldn't think so from the last election, and you certainly wouldn't think so in terms of the emphasis on government policy today.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big issues we've seen is that, and this comes directly from conversations over time I've had, not only with criminal interlocutors, high level, but also high level members of security institutions, including the military, elected officials, so on and so forth, that will tell you that the political calculation has become that it is better to pretend to be doing something about the situation than to get burned while actually trying to do something that has spectacularly backfired in a number of cases in the past. And electorally, it has panned out, unfortunately. We're still in a situation where most of the population in Mexico is not being directly affected by security, right? And the brunt of it is really borne by marginalized populations in mostly rural areas. And so it's not as sufficiently palpable in order to really move the needle, especially when you have a government during this administration, also during the previous administration under the Morena party, that has gone down the route of producing an alternative reality as it comes to security, as is on vogue internationally, and they've gone down the same route, really, and that has proven so far relatively successful. And I think the overwhelmingly good results for Morena that got Claudia Sheinbaum, the current president, the presidency, really shows that that is a very dangerous incentive structure that we have in place right now. And so there's really a harsh disjuncture between local conflict realities and humanitarian cost, the humanitarian crisis that a lot of regions face, and the perception in places like Mexico City that is being kept calm in rather efficient ways.
Okay, so I mean, just to simplify that in a way, the government's policy is to say we are doing something, but there's no real. I tell you what I want to do is I want to give people some concrete examples first, so they can actually understand the full context of it. So let's talk about that example in Jalisco and the so-called extermination camp. There was a ranch which has been uncovered or exposed by people who were involved with it, who have been taken prisoner there, where large numbers of people have been taken over the past few years, literally to be executed. Maybe you can say just a bit more about that.
Yeah, so essentially, I mean, over the past years, we've come across time and again sites of true horror, right? Basically, where certain spaces are being discovered where sort of like a true phase of much of cartel operations comes to the surface, comes to light. And the most recent example is a ranch, if you want to call it that, just outside of a larger cosmopolitan area in Mexico, in the state of Jalisco, where a lot of signs were found that youngsters were being taken there and essentially put to death, especially if they didn't serve an internal purpose as a combatant, for instance, within the organization. I think that is, telling of how many human lives are being wasted as criminal bosses depend on a constant flux of new recruits in order to keep their own war machines running. And I've talked this through with a number of criminal leaders, and I wanted to know if they hadn't run into problems as so many youngsters die during their campaigns on the ground. Because many times they don't get more than like a week of arms training and so on and so forth. So they're really easy cannon fodder, especially for others who knew how to do that job. And I wanted to know if that had produced an HR problem to them. And the response I've been getting is that there's always human refill, from very a dry perspective, as they would phrase it. And I think Teotihuacan, this potential center of extermination that was found a couple of weeks back, is a sign of this constant flux of recruits, how they're being ground up in this war machine that exists in Mexico nowadays. The other key feature, I think, that again sort of was highlighted by this center coming to light was the political reaction. Because first we had what you could read as a positive reaction by the presidency, who said that we do have a disappearance problem in Mexico, hundreds of thousands of disappeared people, from what we can tell, to then quickly change the narrative to an attack against supposed opposition forces trying to drag down the administration's image. And so again, sort of like political incentives, negatively speaking, kick in and really don't allow progressive policy or a policy that would at least recognize the severity of the situation to come into effect.
But the very basic point is that how can you have an apparently quite large ranch killing hundreds of people without people in the area must know about it? The Mexican Attorney General Alejandro Gertz Manero says he said that reinforces the idea of a cover-up. It's not credible the situation of this nature would not have been known to the local authorities of that municipality and the state. Is the state run by another party?
The state is run by another party, but I think there's two things coming together here. So first of all, also when you go into different conflict areas, people know where the mass graves are, right? So it's not a phenomenon limited to this one site in Jalisco. It's a common thing in Mexico. But they are too afraid to speak up because you cannot expect protection by the state. There have been many, many instances where these kind of occurrences were being reported, including by civilians or lower echelons of the state. Your rank and file in the police, for instance, and who were then killed or otherwise harshly punished as a result, because at the end of the day, you run into standard entanglements between security forces and criminal forces. And if these two work together, then really there is no one to investigate those crimes, and there's no one to go to denounce those crimes or expect protection against these crimes from. Can't hear you. Sorry. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'd like to take some questions. We've got, I can see Pieta. If we can get some of these questions of the speakers up so they can put their questions directly to Falko. Jack, what is the government's official line? The previous government had a basically hug the cartels was the idea. Basically trying to see this as a social problem. We need to have economic reform, and then that'll remove crime.
Right. So, a previous administration of former President López Obrador, he said that he would stick to a pacifist stance, and that comes in part, interestingly, from his religious background as well. So there's a lot of complexity involved here. But ultimately, he said he wouldn't fight fire with fire anymore, because that was, in his analysis, what had dragged down Mexico into this hellish state of violence that past presidents had left behind as an inheritance. On the ground, the thing became a bit more complex. So from the criminal actors that I've been able to talk this through with, I've heard one consistent line, and that also comes from their counterparts in the military and so on and so forth. So it is based on multiple sources, not just criminal groups saying one thing, is that a deal was being offered that if you, and I'm going to phrase this a bit less elegantly than it was phrased toward me on the ground, but if you got better at hiding lethal violence, that you would be granted leeway over how you govern your territory as a criminal group. And that meant, above all, less displaying of murder victims publicly and more getting rid of them in clandestine graves. So more disappearing, less public murdering. Basically, that was the recipe in order for criminal groups to keep the military and other security forces off their back. And this is something that is still lingering in this administration. I think the new administration, it's still a bit too early to really say what their course is going to be over the next 5 years. But on the ground, there's a lot of continuity already, because of the reason that you cannot just quickly turn the whole situation around. So again, sort of like a lot of political incentives to keep the worst of it out of the media and try to make hopefully incremental changes in some regions that you could conceivably throw resources at.
Okay, let's take a question from Piotr. Go ahead, if you can just open your microphone, Piotr J. Piotr? Can you hear me? Do you want to open your microphone? You need to open the microphone. It's on the bottom left-hand side. And if you can't, if you're not going to ask a question, I'll ask it for you, which is, so at what point do you assess Mexico as a failed state?
Right. So personally, I'm not a fan of the term failed state per se, because it doesn't capture the complexity of the situation on the ground. So Mexico is in many ways a very, very strong state that has shown time and again its capability to protect its core interests, especially economically speaking, when we talk about the main economies in Mexico, about international trade, about everything that is dear to political and economic elites. When that had come under threat, there has always been a quite consistent crackdown in response to those situations of crisis that could come to question the very stability of the nation state, to put it this way, basically. So the Mexican state is very capable of doing its job when it needs to. It has very well-trained personnel. It has the intelligence to get things done. And when we talk about the security side of things, the military is outgunning any criminal actor on the ground still. They can crack down no problem, and that you can see time and again on the ground. But then again, sort of to a lot of marginalized populations that don't necessarily have an effective voice, that don't have a lobby group behind them, for them it is a failed state in that sense, because they're being victimized without any recourse to state protection. So we have two very, very dramatically different realities. And the question becomes whom you ask about.
We did discuss this. I mean, when we were with you, and you were saying that the state is obviously is very capable, but you also suggested that there are you've talked about the broad social and economic foundations of these organizations, and you've also said that you can't tackle the whole country. It's massive. You can't tackle this all in one place in one go, and so you talked about tactics and the use of what the state has. So you talked about the military, the intelligence services, but also about going after specific areas at one at a time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I mean, the problem has grown out of proportion, right? Basically. So again, sort of like the reigning opinion among criminal groups still is that the military comes after you, get out of the way, right? Basically, so there's still this messaging capacity that is there, But again, sort of the problem has become so broad and the overlaps are so wide between state and crime that if you had the political will to begin with to go after the problem, you would have to start in certain regions, really map out the situation, and then throw resources at those regions to start making a dent and establish a blueprint for how that can be accomplished, essentially.
Because you can't do it all in one go. Okay, well there's some hope there. Elliot Jeter, go ahead, Elliot.
Hi, Falko. When we were in Mexico, you had mentioned there are some states in Mexico that do it well, and they have very little cartel activity. What are the characteristics of those states that allow them to be more effective than others, or are they just geographically blessed?
Yeah, so I think that is, on one hand, has to do with the fact that we haven't reached sort of like the roof of the geographical branching out of the cartels yet. And so some states simply aren't as interesting yet to criminal groups and criminal economies. I mean, when you look at the current map, for instance, of where the bulk of violence is concentrated, it is mostly still along international trade routes where there's something to take, be that oil imports, exports, be humans being trafficked, guns, drugs, and some illicit goods as well, or clusters of industrial activity and so on and so forth. So that's one story. And here the question is, if you don't stop that, what will happen to those other states? So the end of the road hasn't been reached there yet. But there's also states that did experience very high levels of violence for certain periods of time and that were able to turn it around. And here again, it's a bit distinct from region to region, but one of the things we've seen is, one of the big factors we've seen is legal entrepreneurs, the private sector getting together, exercising pressure on the state, pouring resources into public security, including cleansing public security, partially taking over public security, and then doing the job that the state per se proper wasn't able or willing to do, right, basically. And in others, we had different criminal interests pushing in, deciding the battle for themselves, and thus establishing what we call here in Mexico a pax narca. So sort of like a peaceful but criminally dominated state where you have less violence because you just have one group running the show.
Can you say where? Because you're not mentioning where.
Right. So there's a lot of different examples. One is in the state of Coahuila in the north, which used to be hyper-violent as well. You have the industrially very important city of Monterrey in the state of Nuevo León. A bulk of Mexican industrial output happens there. This is where private entrepreneurs, private sector came together. And the state of Veracruz, you have similar stories. And there's more sub-regional islands where that sort of thing has happened. But there isn't one, just representative example, as it were.
Now, I mean, if we go back to this failed state idea, which you don't like, I don't like either. Let's take an example, the state that's certainly not failed, but is also incredibly violent. So that's Guanajuato, which we visited. Guanajuato is part of the automotive industrial manufacturing sector, goes straight linked to the United States. I think it's 80% of what it produces goes to the United States. Yet at the same time, Guanajuato is the state with one of the highest murder rates. So the two shows very clearly that Mexico's advanced economy can work alongside with the cartels, quite happily. But obviously, I mean, that Guanajuato would be one place to start, surely. What would you do there?
So essentially, I mean, if you want to really roll out any type of strategy, you first need to understand who the players are, i.e. you want to have a mapping, a social network analysis of the criminal groups proper. Then you want to branch out into the white collar segment, see who launders their money, where the money comes from, how they refinance their operations. And you want to understand the ties that they have with elected state officials and especially security forces. Even though Guanajuato has a lot of people within their institutions that do want to do the right thing, there's also an element of corruption and collusion involved. And one of the main problems is that that stretches into federal security bodies, increasingly so the military as well. So essentially, you would need to create task forces, including police, military, and state attorneys' offices, where you have highly vetted teams that work as a matter of priority or even exclusively on a regional scenario such as Guanajuato, and you throw them at that setting in order to prosecute cases and take out the central nodes of networks that extort, that kidnap, and that produce other type of grave social harm, right? Basically, that is the first step. When you have tranquilized the situation a little bit, you need to work on social inequality, you need to work on demobilization, reintegration of combatants, as are mostly young people, and you need to provide others who are susceptible of participating in criminal economies and criminal groups with alternatives. So there's a lot of soft power that you need to unfold over time, but first comes really dismantling the relatively small central or population of central nodes within those networks. And the intelligence is there. All we're missing is the political will. And here the problem is, of course, that Guanajuato is governed by a different party than, and has been governed by a different party than the federal government. And so there isn't a lot of, harmony between both levels. And that shows or translates into negative results in terms of security and resources being afforded.
I'd love to get Pieter in for a question, but I don't know where if he can access his microphone. But his last question is, how does it compare to Italy? And that's possibly an unfair question on you because you might not know about Italy.
No, I mean, like, I'm not an expert. I would never pretend to be one. But Italy is a perfect example of how these sort of, of how a state after violence really got out of control. I mean, we're talking about judges being blown up in Sicily in the 90s and so on and so forth, right? I mean, they got their stuff together and they concentrated prosecutorial policing resources in specialized task forces that had the only task of cracking down against the criminal networks. And that happened to the mafia. And ever since, I mean, there is still a problem out there, but it has been reined in and it has become much more peaceful in comparison to the worst days in the 90s. So I think it's a perfect example, a perfect lead of what Mexico could do.
My microphone. The question, we've got about 5 minutes left. How did you get involved in this, Falko? And I think it's worth, before you answer that question, saying actually how you do your job, because you actually do go to some rather risky places and have conversations with some very dubious people.
That is true, I suppose. So, I mean, long story short, I had a well-paid, but rather, from personally speaking, a dulling job as a speechwriter in the German parliament in Berlin, looking for more travel, and I found, I had an interest in Mexican organized crime, applied for a PhD, got in, and then just hit the ground in Mexico and did that with the aspiration to go as deep as I could without pressuring myself into any suicidal sort of type of action. And then just over time, the right contacts panned out, especially among social leaders, local communities that did want to share their story. And once they were able to vouch for me, I also got talking to members of criminal groups, including leaders of so-called cartels, who also happen to have an interest in conveying their own story because they many times feel mistreated by the media, to put it like that, feel misrepresented. And so there is an opening for having these conversations when you show up as a non-judgy outsider, especially from a country like Germany that ostensibly has nothing to do with the conflict. So I think it would have been a different story as an American or as somebody from Mexico. And so, over time I got to have those conversations and hang out. When you do academia, you have a lot of time, you have little pressure to publish, in the short term at least. And so trust was built up, and that led to deeper and deeper conversations, essentially.
And some of those conversations are really quite, I mean, these people who are involved in terrible things are actually quite traumatized themselves. And that was something I hadn't thought about. Yeah.
I think trauma is omnipresent in that particular sub-community, if you want to call it that, and it is something that keeps violence spinning, right? Because it's obviously going untreated. There's a lot of violence among members of criminal groups, especially within what really looks a lot like a hyper-violent hierarchy that suppresses the lower echelon of fighters who are often not paid more than $300 or $400 a month to do the killing down on the ground, while leaders are usually far away from the front line, put it this way. And to keep that in check, you apply violence in order to keep people from running away once they realize what a, pardon my French, shit show, sort of like being a cartel foot soldier really is.
No, it's grim stuff. I mean, you have these conversations. I know you disappear for days, and there's always a question of, well, I would always question whether you're going to come back again.
Yeah, my partner has a very similar questions usually when I go into the field. But so far, out of luck, but I think it's also the fact that you as a foreigner, somebody looking like me, have a high degree of protection in comparison to a Mexican journalist, for instance, right? Basically, criminal groups are very wary of what they call heating up their territory, and heating up their territory by killing a foreigner that would attract an act that would attract attention by my embassy, by the international community, and so on and so forth, is not considered a wise idea. So far, I mean, everything has gone well.
I'm going to try and just go back over what we've learned so far. I mean, this is, you see the emergence of cartels after the arrival of democracy, interesting, because there's no longer one arbiter of power. And you can, there are different people you can do deals with. And so that sort of centralization of power in the state dissipates. And then consequently, all the cartels pop up. There's more competition now, and there's more violence as a consequence. And politicians, so long as the violence doesn't come into the cities and doesn't come into sort of smarter middle-class areas, they're okay to basically, that if you don't get too violent, we're not going to get involved. And that's just as we can talk about being seen to do something, but you're not actually going to take the risk of doing something. Is that fair?
That is fair. I mean, again, there's exceptions to that. I wouldn't throw mud at, the Mexican politician per se, to put it like this. But yes, it is definitely more convenient to.
And yet this government, Morena, has an enormous majority. They've got colossal power. It's the beginning of a mandate, her mandate. She could do something. She could do something,
but that again, political incentives that are rather perverse, I think, kick in. And right now, the situation also is that the greatest priority is to keep the United States relatively happy and thus terrorists off the table as much as you can, and to keep them from sending drones or special forces into Mexico in what would really spell disaster, especially for the Mexican economy. So right now, what you need to do from their perspective is to try and satisfy their demands as concerns security. And that means going after certain people and combating certain very limited manifestations of an organized crime problem, i.e. fentanyl, that is really, really much larger and much more dangerous and needs a much more long-term strategy in order to make any difference at all. But right now, it's a very short-term political game on both sides of the border.
Got it. Okay, we got one question from Alan Livingston. Alan, ask your question. Just open your microphone, which is probably on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Open your microphone, Alan. There you go. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I missed the first part, but one of the things I'm most interested in is the succession within the cartels of leadership. How do they determine how leadership is put forward, and do they have communications with other cartel when it comes to leadership changes?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially, any of these groups has an established hierarchy over time, right? Basically, you have usually one supreme leader, and then you have number twos and different layers below that of the hierarchy in place. So if a top guy is taken out for one reason or the other, there is a natural succession. Normally that should go smoothly, but one of the problems has been that at that very moment, say when a leader is killed or even dies of natural causes from time to time, is being extradited or is being arrested, that the number twos start fighting against each other. They usually all have their own armed elements, their own armed blocks to make war with. And that's been a story over and over again, really, over the past decades in Mexico. So there's a lot of failure for smooth transition between one leader and another that's been driving violence to current levels. And there is communication, a lot of communication, surprisingly so, actually, between even competing criminal groups. I just learned, for instance, that a lot of the leaders whose youngsters kill each other down on the ground, they will come together to drink together and chat and go to cockfights together and things like that, which you would think should be out of the picture, but many times it's very pragmatic in that sense. And there's also the phenomenon that usually, as they all come from the same scene originally, historically, many times from the same original cartel structures, they all know each other. Some of them have grown up with each other, so they aren't anonymous enemies, as it were. And that makes the violence more personal many times when they accuse each other of treason, but there's also a lot of fluctuation in terms of the alliances that are being formed between groups. So, from one week to another, you might be fighting to the death one group, and then when geopolitical conditions change, you engage in an alliance with that very same group once again. It's quite absurd many times. There's a lot of just instability in that mosaic that is organized crime today in Mexico.
Last question from Elaine. Elaine M. Go ahead, Elaine.
Thanks, Nicholas. Good evening, Falko. So there's a female president in Mexico. Are there any women involved in these cartels? It sounds horribly macho.
I think it's still a very macho-dominated world, and you do have macho values coming into play also in the internal organizational cultures of these groups. But there are a number of women involved on all levels. In terms of the leadership positions, there are a few historical examples of women who occupied those positions. And also on the ground, doing the fighting, peddling the drugs, kidnapping people, there has been a bit of a demographic change in the sense that ranks have opened up increasingly, from what I can tell. And there's some studies that I could recommend to that effect that have been produced recently to women. So there's a bit of a, not necessarily positive, democratization of those structures. But I think overall, it is, again, sort of like a very, man-dominated world still.
Well, thank you everyone for your questions. Thank you, Falko, for a great overview. I look forward to coming back to Mexico again. It is an amazing place, and I think in a way, I mean, you've had a very good go at trying to explain how this is the 13th largest economy in the world. It's the engine part of the U.S. economy, yet at the same time, it has this incredible surveillance scene operating at the same time. So thank you very much indeed for all your insights. Thank you for your time.